My name is George. I'm 76 years old. And the worst strategic decision of my life wasn't a failure. It was persistence. There's a sentence you've heard your entire life. A sentence that sounds disciplined, admirable, even noble. I built my entire life around it. And it cost me many years I cannot recover. I won't say the sentence yet, because the moment I do, you'll defend it. And if you defend it, you won't examine it. And if you don't examine it, you'll repeat it. And the people most likely to believe it are the ones it harms most. What I can tell you right now is this. There are people watching this video who are currently in year 3, year 5, year 8 of something that the evidence stopped supporting a long time ago. They're not failing because they lack discipline. They're failing because of a belief they were told. And the belief has made it structurally impossible for them to see what's actually happening. That's not a motivational observation. That's a cognitive architecture problem. And it has a specific solution, but I'm going to make you wait for it. Because if I give it to you now, you've heard it, you've said it. And if you're being precise about it, you've used it to justify continuing something long after the evidence told you to stop. I did. Most people who absorb this advice do. The question isn't whether it sounds right. The question is what it's actually doing to your decision making, and why the damage is almost always invisible until the cost is already permanent. There's a version of persistence that builds something real, and there's a version that is just sunk cost dressed up in the language of character. Most people cannot tell the difference from inside the situation. I couldn't, not for a long time. And understanding why that distinction is so hard to make is the entire point of this conversation. Let me start with why the advice exists at all, because it didn't emerge from nothing. And this matters, because bad advice that has no truth in it doesn't survive. The dangerous kind does. Every compelling piece of bad advice contains a truth. That's the mechanism. Never quit became cultural shorthand, because quitting does carry real costs. Costs that are immediate, visible, and social. When you quit, people see it. When you persist, the suffering is private. So the advice calcified around a very real observation. People often abandon things too early, just before the difficulty resolves. They stop 3 feet from gold, and sometimes that's exactly what's happening. The problem is that the advice doesn't know the difference between those situations. It can't. It's a rule applied universally to situations that are not universal. And the people who built this idea, coaches, military leaders, parents trying to raise resilient children, were working from a legitimate insight. Discomfort is not the same as wrongness. Pain is not the same as failure. Those are true statements. The error wasn't in the observation. The error was in turning a conditional insight into an unconditional instruction. Once it became never, it lost all of its diagnostic value. And here's the part that most people miss entirely. The people most likely to internalize this advice are not the quitters. Think about that for a moment. Quitters don't need to be told not to quit. They've already moved on. The people who absorb never quit and carry it like a doctrine are precisely the people who are already inclined to persist, which means the advice flows in exactly the wrong direction. It concentrates in the people who need it least and offers nothing useful to the people it claims to serve. But that wasn't the real problem, not emotional, structural, and it operates at a level most people never examine. When you commit to never quitting, you don't just commit to persistence, you commit to a specific mode of information processing. Every piece of evidence that suggests you should stop gets routed through a single filter, that's just difficulty talking. Difficulty and wrongness become impossible to distinguish from the inside, and because the belief feels like strength, because it's fused to your identity as someone who doesn't fold, the filter becomes nearly airtight. Here is where I need to tell you about the 11 years. I ran a business that should have closed after 7, and I want to be specific about this because the word should is doing a lot of work in that sentence. I'm not speaking in hindsight. I'm not applying wisdom I didn't have at the time. At year 7, I had the data, revenue trending down for 26 consecutive months. Market contracting in ways that were structural, not cyclical. Margins compressing past the point where operational efficiency could recover them. The picture was not ambiguous. But I had told my children that the kind of person worth being is someone who finishes what he starts. Not once, many times, I had built my public identity around that idea, and I had given it to them as a model for how to move through the world. So when the numbers came back worse every quarter, it processed it as a test of whether I was actually the person I had claimed to be. I passed every test by staying, and what I lost wasn't just the 4 additional years. I need you to understand the second loss, because this is the one that doesn't show up in any accounting, the thing that eventually worked. I think about that number, not with grief, with precision, because the question isn't what those years cost me emotionally. The question is what compounding does to a 4-year head start, and what it means to give that up in defense of a belief. That's the cost nobody counts. Now, what I was doing in that boardroom has a structure, and I didn't recognize it on much later. Economists call part of it the sunk cost fallacy, but what I experienced ran deeper than sunk costs. Sunk cost is about money already spent. What I'm describing is about identity already committed, and the distinction matters enormously. Because the intervention for sunk cost bias is intellectual. The intervention for identity-fused belief is different in kind. You cannot think your way out of a belief that is doing your thinking for you. Here is what I want you to sit with. The belief that quitting is weakness doesn't just make quitting hard. It makes accurate perception hard. Your brain is now motivated to see the situation as one in which persistence is correct, and it will find evidence to support that reading. This is not a moral failure. This is how motivated reasoning works at the neurological level. A belief creates a perceptual bias, and this is precisely where most people misunderstand the problem. The popular rebuttal to never quit is know when to quit. That sounds like progress. It isn't, because it still assumes you can see clearly from inside a committed position. It assumes the judgment mechanism is functioning accurately when the belief system is under stress. Often it isn't, and no amount of knowing about sunk cost bias will protect you if your identity is built around the behavior the bias is protecting. The belief sits upstream of the reasoning. Knowing about the bias doesn't move it. There's a concept in psychology called escalation of commitment, the tendency to increase investment in a failing course of action, precisely because of prior investment. What gets less attention is how identity-level beliefs accelerate this pattern past the point where information can reach it. You can be a sophisticated, educated person who understands cognitive bias in theory and still be completely captured by it in practice, because the capture isn't happening in the part of your mind that reads about psychology. It's happening in the part that decides who you are. This is also where second-order consequences become visible, and second-order consequences are where the real damage lives. When you don't quit the thing you should quit, you automatically don't start the thing you should start. Time is not elastic. Energy is not elastic. Attention is not elastic. The cost of not quitting isn't only the loss at the end of the failed path. It's the compounding opportunity cost of everything that path displaced. Most people, when they evaluate a decision to quit, count what they might lose by stopping. Almost nobody counts what they are losing every day by continuing. That asymmetry in how we account for decisions is, I believe, one of the most consequential thinking errors in how people structure their lives, and it's invisible precisely because the thing you're not building doesn't exist yet. You can't see the absence. Now I want to be precise about something because I've gotten this wrong in conversation, and I want to get it right here. I am not arguing against persistence. I am not making a case for a culture of quitting. Those are misreadings, and they miss the point entirely. What I am arguing is that never quit is not a decision framework. It is a decision suppressor. It doesn't help you make a category of decision well. It prevents that category of decision from being made at all. And any belief that eliminates a category of response is dangerous because reality does not agree to stay inside the categories your beliefs can handle. The framework I eventually built is not the one I wish I'd had at 30. It's the one that would have actually been usable at 47, sitting across from numbers that were telling me something I had structured my entire identity to refuse to hear. It runs on 2 questions, and I want to be clear that these are not the questions most people ask. Most people ask. They're the conclusions you're trying to reach. The questions I'm about to give you are inputs. They generate the output, rather than assuming it. First question, is the obstacle I'm facing internal or external? Internal means the constraint lives inside me. A skill I haven't developed, effort I haven't sustained, mindset that is limiting my execution. If the obstacle is internal, persistence directed at that constraint is usually correct, because effort applied to an internal limit can move it. External means the constraint lives in the environment. Market conditions that have structurally shifted, timing that no longer aligns, resources that don't exist and won't exist, structural misalignment between what I'm building and what the world currently needs. If the constraint is external and structural, meaning it will not change regardless of what I do, then persistence is not a virtue. It is a refusal to read the environment, and refusing to read the environment, it is a specific kind of blindness. Second question, am I processing the evidence I'm seeing as information or as a test? This is the harder question to answer, honestly, because the motivated reasoning I described earlier will try to answer it for you. But it is the diagnostic question. If your consistent response to every negative signal is to increase effort rather than update your model, you may not be persisting through difficulty. You may be persisting through disconfirmation, and those are categorically different situations that require categorically different responses. If the obstacle is internal and you are processing evidence as information, direct your effort at the internal constraint and update your approach as new data arrives. If the obstacle is structural and external, and you are experiencing negative signals as tests of character, rather than as data about the environment, that is the specific condition under which you stopping is not weakness, it is accuracy, it is the correct read of the situation, and calling it quitting at that point is just the belief defending itself. That framework took me longer to arrive at than it should have. And I want to be honest, that even having it doesn't make application easy. The internal versus external distinction is genuinely ambiguous in real situations. Markets shift, skills develop. What was external becomes internal. The line moves. But even with that ambiguity, and this is the critical thing, the framework keeps the decision alive. It forces you to keep asking rather than delegating the answer to a doctrine. And that, structurally, is the entire difference. There is one more thing worth naming. I've saved it for here because I think it's the piece that actually changes behavior rather than just changing how you think about behavior. Those are not the Wenjus, same thing. The people I have watched navigate this well, and in 71 years, you do watch people navigate it well and badly. Do not think about quitting and persisting as character traits. They think about them as positions, and positions should be reviewed. What they build, sometimes formally and sometimes intuitively, is what I'd call a review trigger, a specific pre-committed condition, date, a metric, an external signal at which they will stop and genuinely evaluate whether the past still makes sense, not as a formality, as a real assessment with real stakes. The review trigger matters because it externalizes the decision point. It removes the evaluation from inside the identity and places it on a calendar or a number. That is not a small shift. That is not a small shift. The difference between asking, am I the kind of person who continues, and asking, do the current conditions warrant continuation? The first question is about character. The second question is about reality. You want to be asking the second one, and you cannot ask it reliably from inside a belief that has already answered it. So here is the question I want to leave you with, not as a provocation, as an instrument, something you can actually use for the thing you are currently persisting through. What would have to be true for you to conclude that stopping is the accurate response? If you can answer that with a specific condition, a number, a date, a signal, a threshold, then you are reasoning. The decision is alive. You are doing what the framework asks. If the answer is nothing, if you search for a condition and find that no condition exists under which stopping would be right, then you are not persisting through difficulty. You are enforcing a BTCK belief, and beliefs that cannot be falsified do not protect you from being wrong. They simply make it harder to see that you are. That is the distinction between persistence as a tool and persistence as an identity, between a position you hold for reasons and a doctrine you maintain regardless of them. And knowing which one you're doing, being honest enough to actually look, that is the only version of this that helps. If this made you pause, even for a second, sit with it. If you want more conversations like this, you are welcome to subscribe. I don't offer motivation. I offer clarity,